But the fallout cloud, the mushroom cloud drifted this way, and lots of particles came down in these areas. For the people who are there, they're far enough away that they're not affected by the blast of the weapon. They're not affected by the heat of the weapon. They're not affected by the radioactive rays, but they now live in places where there's a lot of particles that have deposited onto the ground. And it's easy for people to get those particles inside of their bodies. Specifically, it's easy for children to get those particles inside of their bodies. Children are closer to the ground, which is where the particles fall to. Children tend to spend time on the ground, playing on the ground. Children put things in their mouth. Children are much more likely to get particles inside of their bodies than adults. And it will do much more damage to children's bodies because their bodies are growing rapidly. So damage that's being done in the body will present as disease more quickly than it will in adults. So this is basically how fallout makes its way inside of bodies. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is we don't really know how to look at people as being medically affected by fallout. Our models of how radiation affects human beings come from studies done, mostly come from studies done here in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki by what was called the ABCC, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. This was set up by the United States after the war, the idea being prior to 1945, you'd had a few hundred people at most globally who we knew were affected by radiation. So we had a small amount of information about how radiation affects health. After the attacks, the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you have hundreds of thousands of people exposed to radiation. So the idea of this research lab was to study the health of all of the people affected by radiation and to see what kind of diseases and what kind of early mortality come from these exposures. So there were a lot of studies done at the ABCC about the effects of radiation on human health. The key study was called the Lifespan Study. The idea of the Lifespan Study was to see how radiation affected the long-term health of human beings generally. So it started in 1950. It continues till today. Well over 100,000 hibakusha, people who are survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are participants in this study. The way that the study works is that you have to correlate two pieces of data. The dose, you have to know how much radiation each person was affected by. With external radiation, you can pretty much figure that out by finding out where somebody was located in that radiation field. Were they 1 kilometer away? Were they 2 kilometers away? Were they 2.3 kilometers away? And the shielding. In other words, were they inside a house? Were they outside a house? If you have these data points, you can more or less reconstruct how much radiation, external radiation, they were affected by. Then you track the health of these people for the rest of their lives. What kind of diseases do they develop? Do they have early mortality? And you then correlate the dosage, the people who got sick, the people who died young, how much radiation were they affected by? And you build a large database that says this much radiation is likely to produce such and such diseases or such and such early mortality in human beings. This is the Lifespan Study. It's a very large and robust study of health related to radiation exposure. However, from the beginning, the study consciously excluded any consideration of people internalizing radiation, internalizing radioactive particles. There's a lot of reasons why that was excluded from the study. One of the main reasons is that the people being considered received very large doses of external radiation. It was assumed that this would be much more important in their health than if they had gotten a particle inside of them. So it was considered a secondary risk. Also, it was almost impossible to determine who had a particle inside of them and who didn't. So it's really almost would have been impossible to do that kind of science. But the lifespan study is still today considered the gold standard of studying effects of radiation on human beings. Now, it's a valuable study, but its use is problematic. And I'll talk now about why it's problematic. What happened during the Cold War? During the Cold War, we thought there were going to be nuclear weapons used in warfare. We thought there were going to be a lot of people who were exposed to the bursts of nuclear weapons and who would suffer illness similar to the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that's not what happened. We did not use nuclear weapons directly against people again after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So people were not exposed to the bursts of radiation from weapons. Not many people were. Some soldiers were that took part in tests. But there were 2,000 nuclear weapon tests all around the world, on every continent except South America and Antarctica. This is the Bravo test, the largest nuclear weapon test the US ever tested. There were not a lot of people close enough to be affected by radioactive rays, by the burst of radiation. However, this is the cloud, the fallout cloud from the Bravo test 30 minutes later. This cloud would create an area of lethal radiation 5,000 square miles wide. It would completely irradiate the populations of several atolls in the Marshall Islands where the weapon was tested, and hundreds of people would suffer radiation sickness. This cloud would also affect hundreds of tuna fishing boats. The one that we know about is the Daigo Fukuyamoro, the Lucky Dragon. This boat was exposed to radioactive fallout. It was 100 kilometers away. It was exposed to radioactive fallout for hours after the test. When the ship came back to port in Japan, the entire crew was hospitalized with radiation sickness. One crew member died 6 months later. So he was 100 kilometers away from where an H-bomb was tested, and it killed him 6 months later from radiation. So what happened to people didn't really have much to do with the lifespan study. People were not exposed to big bursts of external radiation. What really happened in the Cold War is that millions of people internalized radioactive particles. We don't have a medical model for how that affects health. So we pretend it doesn't. We assume that people exposed to radiation really are not in danger if the external levels of radiation are not high. Hang on one second. So the lifespan study is used to dismiss the health effects of radiation. The lifespan study tells us people have health risks if they're exposed to large amounts of external radiation. Not a lot of people are exposed to large amounts of external radiation. Millions of people have been exposed to fallout. We don't have a model for how that affects them. But we do have the lifespan study, so we use the lifespan study to dismiss their exposures. If in a place like Fukushima, where there's a lot of radioactive particles that have come down from the clouds, the way we decide if people are at risk or not is we use Geiger counters to measure the amount of external radiation. That level's not high, so we say people are not at risk. But their risk isn't from external radiation. Their risk is from living with these particles, getting it in their food, having it in the water, having it in the soil of their homes. This is the risk. And the lifespan study does not in any way address that risk. So it's an inappropriate way to interpret the health risks to them, but it's what we do. And it's been done throughout since 1945. It's been done to dismiss the very real health impacts on people who live where fallout clouds drop particles. Now, there's a scientific sort of accidental inevitability to this. We don't have a model for it. We do have a model for external radiation, so we apply it to people who live with fallout. So it seems like this is just unfortunate. But what I would like to point out is that we absolutely understood from long before Hiroshima these dangers. The idea of radioactive fallout making people sick became a key way we intended to use nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. So the health effects of internalized radiation have always been dismissed as negligible by invoking the lifespan study. But they've always been understood as a primary weapon effect of nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies by militaries. So here are some examples. This is a statement that comes from a document written by Manhattan Project scientists in 1943. This is before the weapons were developed. They weren't sure the weapons would work, but they already realized that fallout could kill people. Here's the quote. A somewhat different use of the radioactive material would depend on the fact that extremely small quantities of certain of the radioactive elements appear to be absorbed in the lungs of animals and produce fatal effects after a period of some weeks. The amounts necessary to produce eventual death under such conditions are extraordinarily small. This means that if such materials could be kept in the air in the form of a fine dust or smoke in concentrations as low as 0.002 of a microgram per liter, inhalation of such atmosphere for 1 hour would be sufficient to establish a lethal concentration. The material would accumulate in the lungs, and the individual would eventually die of the radioactive poison. There is no known way in which such a contaminated individual could be successfully treated once he had thus been exposed. This was known by the Soviets as well. This is from a 1940 document in which the Soviet Union was imagining the possibility, Soviet scientists were imagining the possibility of building nuclear weapons, but they also realized that fallout would be a really important military weapon. As a result of a uranium bomb explosion, radioactive substances are created. It has a toxic capacity which is thousands of times greater than the strongest poison, and thus ordinary toxic agents. Therefore, taking into account that after an explosion, radioactive debris will exist during a certain period of time in gaseous form, and that it will spread across a vast area while keeping its toxic capabilities for a relatively long time, for hours or for some fission products, even days or weeks. It is difficult to say what feature, high destructive capacity or toxicological characteristics, is the most attractive in this regard militarily. So even before nuclear weapons were built, both the Soviets and the United States were realizing that internalized radioactive particles, that radioactive fallout, could be an incredibly potent weapon to kill people. The US really understood this after its first post-1945 nuclear weapon tests. This is the Baker test in the Marshall Islands at Bikini Atoll in July of 1946. This was an underwater nuclear weapon test. So you'll notice this mushroom cloud is not rising high up into the air, but instead it's very low and wide. This is because it's full of water. Since it was underwater, it raised all of this water up into the air, and that water fell back down into the lagoon of Bikini Atoll. So instead of the radioactive fallout rising into the sky and dispersing downwind, all of these particles stayed in the lagoon at Bikini. And all of the troops, 40,000 US troops on boats that were doing assessments of the impact of this explosion on animals and on materials, all of them began to get sick with radiation. Lots of people began to get exposed to radiation. It was actually scientists there realizing that fish caught in the lagoon were full of radiation, not on the surface of their skin because they were swimming in radioactive water, but inside their bellies because they were consuming radioactive particles in the food they were eating. This is why the US military decided to evacuate all 40,000 of the troops that were in Bikini Atoll at that time. They realized that the radioactive fallout would make these troops sick. More importantly, though, they realized that making fallout like this could be an incredibly potent military weapon and a psychological terror weapon. In their assessments of this test, these are some of the conclusions they came to. Test Baker gave evidence that the detonation of a bomb in a body of water contiguous to a city would vastly enhance its radiation effects by the creation of a base surge whose mist, contaminated with fission products and dispersed by wind over great areas, would have not only an immediately lethal effect, but would establish a long-term hazard through the contamination of structures by the deposition of radiological particles. We can form no adequate mental picture of the multiple disasters which would befall a modern city blasted by one or more atomic bombs and enveloped with radioactive mists. Of the survivors in contaminated areas, some would be doomed to die of radiation sickness in hours, some in days, others in years. But these areas, irregular in size and shape as wind and topography would form them, would have no visible boundaries. No survivor could be certain he was not among the doomed. And so, added to every terror of the moment, thousands would be stricken with the fear of death and the uncertainty of the time of its arrival. So remember President Kennedy warning Americans about radioactive fallout in 1961? Radioactive fallout extending downwind from as much as several hundred miles could account for the major part of the casualties which might result from a thermonuclear attack. So Kennedy is warning Americans about radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons, detonations, especially thermonuclear weapons, H-bombs. So how did Kennedy really feel about this? Well, the very next year, Kennedy approved Operation Dominic, in which 36 nuclear weapons were tested in the Pacific, including 9 of these thermonuclear weapons that would create lethal areas for thousands of miles downwind. In total, the following year after Kennedy made this statement, the US would test 96 nuclear weapons. Globally, all nuclear weapon states would test 177 nuclear weapons in 1962 on 4 continents and multiple Pacific territories. Fallout would spread in 1962 through Asia, through Europe, through North America, and through the Pacific. Statistically, in 1962, there was a nuclear test every other day. This is after Kennedy is warning people about how deadly fallout is. He is, along with other military and political leaders, inflicting radioactive fallout on the world. Now, the way I want you to understand this history today is in relationship to Fukushima. Much like a fallout cloud rises up from a nuclear detonation full of particles that will spread downwind, this is what happens when there are explosions at nuclear power plants. This fallout cloud and the other fallout clouds from Fukushima, much like the ones from Chernobyl and the fire at Chernobyl, would spread radiation across a large area downwind, far away from where the plants were. People who live out here where the fallout has landed in Fukushima, they were not being exposed to high levels of external radiation from the plant. The plant is far away. They're being exposed to fallout that came down from the fallout clouds. So what do we say about the risks to these people in Fukushima? We use the lifespan study, and we use Geiger counters, and we say the levels of radiation are not so high, so people are not at risk. This is what the lifespan study tells us. People are not at risk because those external levels are low. But just as all of this military strategy makes clear, we're very well aware that lots of people in these areas are going to get sick, and that these areas are not going to be clearly defined, and nobody will be able to know if they are among the people affected or not And this will create a psychological terror along with the illnesses that come from internalizing radioactive particles. So because of the studies we did here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have created medical models that make the main ways people are exposed to radiation medically invisible. This is what people deal with at Fukushima. This is what people deal with at Hanford, Washington. This is what people deal with near Chernobyl. This is what people deal with near all of the nuclear test sites. And this is how we have been able throughout this history to pretend that these people are just kind of irrational in worrying about radiation. There's nothing to worry about because the lifespan study tells us the levels are low. This is disingenuous. We've known all along that these effects will kill people and these effects will make people sick. And it's just that it's very difficult for them to understand this. And our analysis of the use of fallout was kept secret throughout the Cold War history. And all of this contributes to the risks to people and the effects of people in areas like Fukushima remaining uncertain to us and seemingly unpredictable to us. That's not exactly true. So that's where I want to leave us with talking about this, with this presentation. And now any of this I'm happy to talk about, or global hibakusha history, or specifically how this relates to Fukushima. Because what you have in a place like Fukushima is a massive distribution of particles. You can, because they are embedded into the ecosystem, you can decontaminate a house, you can decontaminate a schoolyard, but as soon as it rains and the wind blows, more particles will migrate into these areas. You cannot sanitize a piece of an ecosystem from the rest of the ecosystem.